Okay, let's dive into a classic story about persistence, one you've probably heard before. It seems pretty straightforward on the surface, but if we dig just a little bit deeper, it completely flips our understanding of who's who in the story. It's a pretty wild twist. So, Jesus tells this story, and you've got two main characters, right? There's this judge who, frankly, couldn't care less about God or other people. And then you have this widow who just will not give up. She is relentless. Seems like a simple story about determination. And the moral of the story seems pretty obvious too. Jesus is basically telling his followers, hey, be like this widow, keep praying, don't lose heart, be persistent. And you could just stop there and say, okay, case closed, but it's not quite that simple. So let's ask a question. What if this story isn't just a story? What if it's actually tapping into a very real, very common struggle that people at the time would have instantly recognized? This might sound a little wild, but this ancient parable actually has a direct connection to an incredible discovery made in the 20th century. It turns out the persistent widow isn't just a character. She was a real person, and we even know her name. And this is where it gets really fascinating. We're talking about a time gap of nearly 2,000 years here. In 1961, near where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, archaeologists stumbled upon a collection of personal documents, and they all belonged to one woman, a Jewish widow named Babatha. And we're not talking about just a few scraps of paper. They found 35 separate papyrus documents. 35! These were her actual, meticulously kept legal files, basically her whole life laid out on these ancient pages. And when you look at what these papers are, wow, they paint this incredible picture. Babatha was a fighter. She was in court all the time, fighting over inheritance from not one, but two deceased husbands, fighting with her son's trustees, even battling her second husband's other wife over assets. I mean, she was the living, breathing definition of a persistent widow. So finding Babatha's story really grounds this whole parable in reality. It shows us that when Jesus told this story, the people listening would have been nodding along. They knew women like this. This wasn't some abstract concept to them. It was real life. Okay, but here's where we hit a snag. A really big one, actually. If we stick with that simple traditional interpretation, that this story is all about how we should pray, it leads us to a pretty troubling place. Think about it. If we're the persistent widow banging on the door and demanding justice, who does that make God in the story? The unjust judge? A figure who only helps us because we've annoyed him so much he just wants us to go away? That just doesn't feel right, does it? You know, Mark Twain actually nailed this very skepticism through Huckleberry Finn. Huck decides to try out praying. He asks for some fishing hooks a few times but gets nothing. And his conclusion is pretty blunt. If prayer was just about asking enough times, well, a lot of bad stuff wouldn't happen to good people. It's a simple but really powerful critique of that whole idea. And this isn't just some philosophical debate. It gets really, really painful when you think about real life. Imagine someone praying, begging for their sick child to get better, or for a dying spouse to survive. Are we really supposed to believe their prayers went unanswered because they just didn't try hard enough? That feels not just wrong, but cruel. So that's the conflict. That traditional reading of the parable can paint a picture of God that just doesn't line up with what we know about love and compassion. And worse, it can make people blame themselves when they're already hurting so much. Okay, so what if we've been looking at this whole thing completely backwards? This is the big pivot, the radical reframing. What happens if we just flip the script entirely? All right, hang with me here, because this is the twist. What if we are the unjust judge, wrapped up in our own lives, too busy, too self-absorbed to really listen? And what if God is the persistent widow, the one who keeps knocking, keeps calling, desperately trying to get our attention? See how that just changes everything? All of a sudden, this story isn't about how hard we have to work to get God's attention. It's about how relentlessly God works to get ours. It's about a stubborn, determined grace that never, ever gives up on us, even when we ignore the call. It's not so much about us believing in God, but about God always believing in us. So, let's unpack that. If we run with this idea that God is the one doing the pursuing, it forces us to ask a whole new set of questions about what it all means for us today. I mean, If God is the one knocking, what does that knock sound like? How does God call out to us? Well, the parable itself gives us a pretty big clue. The widow is someone who's been wronged, denied justice, and deprived of compassion. So maybe, just maybe, God calls to us through the voices of people in our world who are in that exact same position. Perhaps God is calling out to us through the voices of the modern widows all around us. You know, the lonely, the overlooked, the people crying out for fair treatment. When we see people in pain, when we hear those cries for justice, is it possible that that is God's voice speaking to us, asking us, the judges, to finally listen? And that's the big takeaway here. It's a powerful invitation. It's a call not just to be persistent in our own prayers, but maybe just as important, to be persistent in listening for the prayers of others, to pay attention to the cry of the widow in our own time. This is that persistent call. This is the message that God, the widow, is trying to deliver to us, the judge. It's an invitation to stop being so self-absorbed, to finally open the door and to listen to that relentless voice calling us to come home.